It's Bobby from brewhardware.com, and this video is a long time coming. It's a review and a contrast of several different electric brewing controllers. Now, the market for electric brewing is well into maturity at this point. Many of the big players have their flagship controller, and I wanted to do an overview of the major features and pros and cons of the major players in the market. Of course, this is only my opinion. I have to say that up front, but I have been brewing electric for over 10 years for myself, and I've also demoed all of these controllers on several batches to be able to do an honest comparison and contrast between them. Also, in full disclosure, the three major brands that I'm going to be looking at today and talking about are brands that I sell at brewhardware.com. One thing to note, though, is that I don't make any more or less profit on any of these controllers, so I can be pretty unbiased about their comparisons and contrasts, because if I sell you any one of these, I'm making about the same amount of profit. So I hope I can give you an unbiased and honest look at all the features, pros and cons and contrasts between these controllers, as well as any others in the market that you want to know about. Now, all three of these controllers, whether it be the Spike Solo, the Blichmann Brew Commander, or the Auber Cube, are designed to switch one element in one vessel, and or at least at the same time. Any of these three controllers can be used on either 120 volt or 240 volt circuits in your house. Now, for the most part, if you're doing 5-gallon batches and larger, you're going to be focusing on the 240 volt units, whereas if you're going just under 5 or maybe up to 5, you can use the 120 volt units. But for the most part, these are going to be 240 volt, 30 amp circuit requirements, and they can support an element in the range of 4,500 watts all the way up to about 6,500. You'll find the most common element wattages are 4,500 up to 5,500. One thing that you're going to find is that the feature set is quite varied between all of these, and it is important to talk about all of the nuances to make sure that each of these controllers can do what you're expecting them to do. There are quite a bit of ranges as far as complexity or programmability, and we'll talk about those in detail. Now, the Spike controller is really sleek. It's got a lot of different angular surfaces that make it look like a stealth bomber. It's a mix of black metal and plastic with red logo graphics around everywhere. And it can be tabletop or wall mounted. So on a table, it sits like that, and all the cables come out the back. And then if you wanted to wall mount this, the cables will be rerouted just by removing them from these keepers, right? And then you can move all the cables down so that they exit out the bottom of the unit, and then you can attach this to the wall and the cables will come down because there's a standoff with space behind the controller. All right, so that's why that is easily adaptable from tabletop to wall mount. Now, the display it's not super bright. You have to look pretty much directly on, and you can read the display pretty well. The footprint is moderate at about 12 by 8. I would say I'd give this a 7 out of 10 if it were a beauty contest. It has modern styling, and I'll give it an extra point for its mounting flexibility, so like 8 out of 10 overall. Now, this is a very compact and clean looking controller with the smallest footprint of any controller that we've seen, whether it be a 120 volt or a 240 volt unit. So really nice and compact, right? There's my hands for comparison. It's about 4 inches by 6 inches on the table as far as the footprint. It is a mix of brushed stainless steel and black anodized extruded aluminum. There's really very little plastic on this except for the frame around the screen. The screen on this is about the same size, if not a touch bigger than the one on the Spike. Now, out of the box, this unit is meant for tabletop use. It's got rubber feet on the bottom. The cables are coming out the back right here. It does have a DIN rail on the back here so that you can mount a DIN rail to the wall and then slide this controller onto the DIN rail to hang it off the wall. However, the one bummer about wall mounting this unit is that this does have to be taken apart so that you can reroute the wires underneath so that they don't jam into the wall. Blichmann does provide instructions, and you can find retailers, hint hint, that will perform this conversion for a nominal fee. Now, I'd give this controller a 7 out of 10 for its looks, but I have to take a point away for the fact that wall mounting this is a bit of a hassle. But I'll give it a point back for the extremely compact footprint of this controller. So I'd give this a 7 out of 10 for the overall form factor and looks. Now, let's move on to the Auber Cube. Now, this is the utilitarian of the bunch. There's a small percentage of users out there probably that would find some retro charm in this 1980s lab equipment sort of aesthetic that they've got going on. It's not going to win any beauty contests, we know that. It does have a rather large footprint, about 10 by 10 on the table. The enclosure is entirely durable metal, which that is a nice feature, and it's got a painted or powder coated beige paint on the steel enclosure. There are some brushed aluminum accents on the front panel, as well as the aluminum heatsink and some grab handles here. Now, this is a tabletop unit for sure, the way that it's set up. Probably the only way that you're going to be able to make this wall mountable is if you were to get some mounts that were meant for like bookshelf speakers, or set up a simple shelf that this will sit on. But the cables do have to come out the back, and there is no way to reconfigure this so that they come out the bottom. So that is one of the limitations. Overall, I'd give a generous 6 out of 10 for looks. I would say they can do better by offering this in a completely stainless or black finish, which will make it compete a little bit more with the nice Spike Solo. Even if you wanted to just paint this all black yourself, I think it would be a huge step up in the aesthetic department. Well, the next thing we want to talk about is the ease of use and what the learning curve is on all of these. And I could say that the entire review is really going to be touching on this topic throughout, so it's hard to kind of summarize it all in one neat place like this. But in general, it's safe to say that the easier the controller is to use, especially as a new user, the less feature-rich it's going to be. One thing we'll touch on is the controller's ability to function simply at first and then allow for more complex features later as the user grows more competent. Now, one thing we're going to do is look at the interface and how we interact with the controls for programming these things, such as brew day inputs, and finally how the controller informs us the status of more important events. We'll be looking at user inputs, such as how to tell it what we want it to do, feedback, how it tells us what it's currently doing, alarms, how it alerts us when we're distracted or out of view of the display, and then overall readability. The Spike Solo has a very intuitive user interface using all tactile physical switches and knobs. You have a switch for element enable or disable, pump on and off, and then there's a 120 volt auxiliary output also. So nice, real nice, solid, positive clicks when they're on and off. And then also for adjusting your temperature targets or your boil intensity, you've got these nice knurled knobs to adjust the modes. So that's pretty much how you control this entire controller, is those 3 switches and these 2 knobs. There also is a power switch for the overall unit that turns the display, the control, and the cooling fan on. You have a selector knob right here with 2 possible positions to go between the mashing mode, which is really a temperature control mode, and the boil mode, which is a power control or boil intensity control mode. That's pretty much all that does. Then the knob here is for adjusting your target output. Now, there are a few omissions in feature set on this controller as compared to others that are not that big of a deal. And those are the fact that there's no timer built into this unit. There's no alarm or any kind of buzzer that sets off when your targets are achieved. And those can kind of be forgiven in light of using a lot of things like brewing software that has brew day timers built in, for example. Except the one thing that's missing from this controller that I personally feel is a little bit of a deal breaker is that there is no indication anywhere that the element is currently firing. So almost all other controllers have some indication that the element is hot or heating, and this one does not have that. So the downside is, other than just not being sort of informed as the brewer, there is a higher chance of dry firing your element when this controller is heating the element and you don't really know that it's happening. So when you're draining your cleaning solution at the end of the brew day, for example, after you're tired, there's no red light on this thing telling you that the element's firing and you're about to dry fire it when you're draining all your cleaning solution out. All right, we're moving on to the Blichmann Brew Commander. This is a very intuitive interface for sure. You got this color screen, but it's also a touch screen. So there is no, other than the power switch right here, there are no external buttons. So one thing that's extremely intuitive about this is that all the inputs are done via touch screen, just like all of our mobile devices, so it's really natural. You got a pump switch there, you just press it, it lights up when it's enabled, and it goes gray when it's disabled. All right, when you first start up the Brew Commander, it shows you the home screen, which is here now, and you can do everything that the Solo controller can do right from this screen and even a little bit more. The first thing to understand is that that's the actual temperature that's being sensed at the probe. There's your temperature target, there's your power mode, and there's a timer display as well. So right now it's off, it's not heating, everything's black. You'll see the first thing that lights up is auto. Auto is essentially your mashing mode or your temperature target mode. You can see that I have 125 degrees Fahrenheit as my target. My current temperature is 67.6. So you can see this is displaying blue, meaning it's below or colder than your set point. Now, if I want to change my target, I just pressed 125. I can lower this down. Let's say that I want to go to 55 degrees, which is unrealistic, but let's just put it in there. Hit enter. Now you can see that this changes to red, meaning the actual temperature is hotter than our set point. And then the next phase of the mode button goes to off again, but when you press it again, it'll go into on mode, which means boil mode. This is not a temperature seeking mode, so this is really for regulating your boil power. And the way that you enter the power that you want is you press the percentage. You can put in like 50%, 50. I'm doing this upside down, so it's harder to see. And you can see boil mode, 50% power. And you can see that there's a little icon in red that says heat, and it is cycling on and off at about 50% duty cycle. You can also use the timer feature on here. You just go into the menu, press timer, press the keyboard, set 1 minute, hit enter, press play. You can see the timer starts. Go back to the home screen and the timer is displayed. Like I just showed you, this controller does have timers built in and it's displayed on the home screen. And it also sounds an alarm or makes a beep at the end of the timer or when the temperature is achieved in temperature mode. Now, unlike the Solo controller, this does have an indication that the element is firing. So if I set my temperature target to, let's say, 200 degrees, hit enter, you can see that it's colder than the set point, so the heat indicator is coming on. I have it set to 50% maximum power. If I have that big of a temperature change to jump up, I'm really going to change this to allow 100% power. So now it's showing the elements on full time. So I think this unit has a lot of great features right on the home screen. This is a very intuitive controller as far as input and status updates, as well as readability. Now the Auber Cube is unique in that the element enable and pump on and off switches are actual physical industrial style switches. The element control logic is contained within the 16th DIN module, and it has a very low resolution 7-segment display with, sort of limited characters and a simple push button knob. There's a couple of other soft push button switches on here. While the overall build is suggestive of a PID style industrial control, the brains of this module are actually much more evolved than that. They're really designed for brewing specifically. Now the display is typically going to cycle between the set temp and the program temp, but because there's timers and programmability built into this, a lot of times the display will cycle back and forth between what mode it's in as well as what the timer or the remaining time is on here. So it's a little confusing to understand what's going on at first until you use it a couple of times. This system does sound alarms when the set points are reached or any of the timers run out to 0. Now, the one thing that I really like about this controller is that it has one of the largest element firing indicators of all the controllers. So if I flip on the element enable, obvious that the element is firing, and this will reduce your chances of an element dry fire pretty significantly, because if you're anywhere near your brewing system, you're going to see that this light is on. Now there is a button on the front here to turn off the basic electronics of the module, but you can turn that on to do some pre-programming before you turn the element enable on. So the element enable is a circuit breaker panel switch, and then the pump is a very positive on-off style 2-position selector. Now these physical switches and industrial controls are very intuitive, but the logic inputs into the brain or the module are the least intuitive of all 3 controllers. That's a fact. And the bottom line is that the learning curve is a little steeper on this one, and it will take a couple of brew days to settle into, for sure. Let's talk about automation. There are some brewers out there that want to multitask on brew day, maybe go cut the grass while the beer is brewing, or do a little childcare, whatever it may be. There is a desire sometimes to have a less hands-on approach to the temperature control of the brew day. And a lot of controllers feature time or event-based programming that takes some of the burden off the brewer during a complex brew day. As recipe and pipeline software such as Brewfather becomes more popular, the controller's need to step through programs is perhaps diminished, but let's talk about what features are on offer anyway. So the first is delay start. Delay start is just being able to set up your brew system the night before and have it come on before you're out of bed. Or maybe you're preparing breakfast and making some coffee and you want the water to be heating without your intervention. Now, the delay start features of the Brew Commander and the Cube that has the DSPR 320 module, which this one does, those both allow for a delay start timer, and you can have this thing fire up first thing in the morning, for example. The Spike has no kind of timer, so it definitely doesn't have any sort of delay start or otherwise. Now this feature is much more useful on an underpowered system using 120 volts than on a 5,000 plus watt system. Generally, firing up manually the first thing in the morning, like I said, get up, you turn your brew system on and set the target temperature and go ahead and make a cup of coffee or take a shower. By the time you come back out ready to brew, this thing is hot and ready to go. So it's really not that big of a deal breaker not to have a delay start timer. So all 3 of these are sort of equally good in that regard if you're running a 240 volt brewing system. Each brewing system has timers built in except for the Spike Solo. So if you want timers, you got to go with one of these. If you will offload your timing to an app or some timer on your smartphone, then the Spike Solo would not be a hindrance in that regard. Now the other thing to talk about, which gets a little bit complex, so we're going to take this slowly, is multi-step temperature programming. I also like to call this the temperature for a time style programming, such as 150 degrees Fahrenheit for 45 minutes and so on. As we said, Spike Solo is completely devoid of any scheduled programming. You just manually set a temperature and it holds on to that temperature indefinitely until you change it or turn the controller off. So multi-step timing is out for this one. The Brew Commander requires some very special nuanced explanation, because if you read the specs or you look at the programming in the back end here, it does have a robust set of programmable mashing and boiling schedules. However, there are some quirks that reduce its utility quite a bit. The mash scheduler lets the user program up to 9 unique schedules, each with up to 5 temperature targets and time periods. In boil mode, you can program up to 9 unique schedules that can alert you to add up to 9 boil additions, probably just hop additions or wall flock or something like that. Now, programming boil addition alerts has some utility if you typically follow a printed recipe and would otherwise set an external timer. If you're already using recipe software such as Brewfather or Beersmith, that software is going to already know what your hop addition timing is going to be, and it'll provide brew day alerts if you're running the brew day timer. So if you were to program those into this controller, it would be somewhat redundant because your software and your hardware would be telling you to add the hops kind of simultaneously. Now, we should take a closer look at the mash scheduler feature. And what you do is you go into the menu, you go into mash, and you can see that this is the mash profile screen. So we're in profile number 1. You can just keep pressing that to switch to the various profiles. They're all programmed with 0 degrees for 0 minutes at the moment, because this is a brand new controller right out of the box. But what you would do is you press select. That'll get your first temperature, and you can open up the keyboard like that, and you can put in 122 degrees, enter. And then it's asking you for how long would you like that. Let's say 5 minutes, enter. And it just keeps stepping you through temperature, time, and so on. And then when you want to, let's just enter one more, say 155, enter. And let's say that one's going to go for 45 minutes. Enter. And let's say we're going to go to run. So now it's starting that program. We can go into home. You can see that it's set for 122 degrees because it's obeying the timer schedule now. And you can see that the timer is going down from 5 minutes. Now, this programming seems very intuitive, and that each of the timers are going to just run for the durations that you put in there, 1 minute, 60 minutes, whatever it is. And that each of those timers would start when the temperature was achieved. However, there's some reason why Blichmann programmed these controllers to work a completely non-intuitive way. For example, you can see that the target temperature is 122 degrees. We're at 66.5 Fahrenheit. And that step timer has already started, and it doesn't make any sense that that would do that. The way that it actually works is that it wants you to program into the menu. Let me just go into the advanced menu here. Go into the, press the gear here to go into the advanced settings. So there is a parameter called mash heat rate. It's currently defaulted to 2 degrees Fahrenheit per minute. As a controller transitions from one rest temperature step to the next, it starts a ramp timer that compares the needed temperature rise against the user inputted ramp rate that's in that advanced menu. If you think it's hard to understand this, it's even worse when you try to use it on a single vessel brew in a bag system. What happens in practice is that each of the step timers starts too early or too late because that calculated mash ramp time is unrealistic. You can never enter the right ramp rate. Now, this feature is so poorly implemented that I wouldn't even consider the mash scheduler to be a feature of this controller. That's not to say that it needs to have this feature to be a good value or a useful controller. It's just that I don't think the mash scheduler should be a feature that you use to determine whether you would buy this controller or not buy it. What I would suggest is look at the controller from its performance on the home page only as whether you'd want these features for this price or not. Now we move on to the Auber, and while this has sort of been the black sheep of the review so far because of the form factor and the hard to read 7-segment displays, I will say that when it's equipped with the DSPR 320 module, which is this one here, it is one of the most sophisticated controllers if scheduled programs are your priority. So this has 9 different programmable targets in 2 different banks, so for a total of 18 total targets. You can do those as 2 separate profiles that you keep in the memory forever, or you can make a really long program that is 18 slots long and it'll run through each of those steps. The other thing that's pretty cool about this controller is that each of those targets can either be a temperature target mode or a boil power modes. And the other thing that I like about the programmability of this is that in addition to just entering your target time in minutes, you can also set other things like hold, where the controller will just sit there and wait for you to continue the program. It's pretty useful. There are 2 examples of where I use that feature. One is when I first have it run up to the strike temperature before I drop my grain bag in. I want to have it hold my strike temperature in case I get distracted and have to be somewhere. I don't want the program to keep running, so I'll come over and I will advance the controller to the first sack rest temperature and drop the grain in. And then another reason why is if you have it run through the entire mash schedule all the way up to a mash out, you don't want it to continue on to the ramp to boil while the grain bag is still in the kettle. So I'll have it wait for me at the mash out temperature until I pull the grain bag out, and then I'll continue the program. So just as an example, right now, my first target I have set to 67 degrees and it's currently 65. So let me just see if I can kind of warm this up with my body temperature and we'll see. Okay, so I just achieved that first target, and the time I set to was to hold, not to a specific number of minutes. So you can see that the controller is sitting here waiting. It's just fluttering the element to hold that temperature. And when I come over and drop my grain in, I'm going to hit the run button, and that will move on to the next target temperature. So pretty cool how it's just very flexible in that way. And I could have had the next mode be a boil mode at 55% power. It didn't need to be a temperature target. So you just keep programming the time slots to do whatever you want them to do. And when you get to the last slot that you want to program, you just set the time to the word end instead of hold or a time in minutes, and it will just end the program right there and shut the element off. All right, let's move on to the next topic is alarms. So Spike doesn't have any alarms or buzzers built into the controller. The Auber Cube, regardless of the module, and the Blichmann Brew Commander both have buzzers or beepers built in, and they generally will beep at the end of timers or when temperatures are actually achieved. They do a different series of, or a different number of beeps depending on what it's ringing out for. The beeper built into the Brew Commander is pretty loud. I mean, you can hear it from several feet away. The one built into the modules of the Auber Cube are also kind of, several feet away. You can hear them. One thing that's interesting about this module is you can wire in an external buzzer. It would be a mod to this controller. It doesn't come like this from the factory, but it does have relay contacts built into the module, so you can power external flashes or strobes, really loud buzzers and all that sort of thing. So it is a little bit more flexible and upgradable in that regard, whereas this is all built into the circuit board and not really something you can modify. All right, so we're going to look at these units as far as the inputs and outputs and the electrical connectivity and how flexible that is. Now the Spike Solo has a 4-prong input cable. It's a short little dongle coming in. It is 4 prongs because both the 240 and 120 volt power comes into this controller on a common connection. And they do supply a cable that is about 6 feet long, and you attach this twist lock. This is an L14 30 R and P joint there, and then they have a straight bladed plug that goes into your wall. So that is how it gets 240 volts and 120 volts on the same cable. And that is so that the controller can switch the power going to the element as well as the 220 volt 15 amp receptacles that are hanging out the back as well. The element output is a 3-wire connector because it only needs to carry 240 volt, and this is known as a NEMA L630R. This is the female side, and it's got 3 prongs in a circular formation. And this controller does not come with an extension cord to go from here to your element. If you need to go further away, then you would have to purchase an extension cord that is an L630 extension cord, male on one side and female on the other. Most brewing elements have an L630P prong on the back that this extension cord would just twist right onto. Okay, and the temperature probe is connected to the back of the controller with a 3-pin XLR. This is like a microphone cable. Just comes apart like that. I'm going to talk about the Auber Cube next because it is more like the Spike than it is the Brew Commander. The input to the back of this controller is also a 4-prong. This is an L14 30R, and the back of the controller has a panel mount L14 30P. So this also is a 4-wire input, again for the same reason that the Spike Solo is. It needs to get 240 and 120 volt at the same time, so you get 2 hots, a neutral, and a ground. And the outputs are the same as the Solo as well. You have an L630 for the element output and just a NEMA 515 standard 120 volt receptacle on the back for your pump. The Auber Cube does not come with a power input cable or an element output cable. Those are all separate. So basically you would buy a cable like this one to get the power in, right? So your 4-prong in, and then you would buy whatever L630 extension cord length you would need to go from this controller here to the element. It does come with the probe cable, just like the Solo controller. So, but you do need to purchase the input and output cable. Next, we're going to talk about the Blichmann Brew Commander. This particular unit that I have on display in this video is the 120 volt version. So I have to kind of show you that the back of the typical 240 volt controller is like this bundle of cables I'm holding on to. In fact, these were taken out of one of the controllers. So on the 240 volt unit, this is exactly what you get. You have an L630P male plug, which is the 240 volt input into the controller. You have an L630R, which is the element output of the controller. And then you have a NEMA 5-15P. This is a typical male plug of a 120 volt circuit. This supplies the controller with power just for the pump output. So what Blichmann wanted to do was maintain maximum flexibility for people who only have 3-wire 240-volt outlets. Unlike what I said was like the modern dryer outlet. This will plug into a 240 only outlet, such as a welder or an older dryer receptacle. And most people will find a 120-volt circuit anywhere in the house to plug this one into. So it's a little bit cumbersome. There's more cables to worry about. The controller itself actually runs on the 240 input. You can't just plug this 120 in and start goofing around with the screen, because the whole controller won't come on until the 240 is plugged in. But what it means is that the circuit that comes in and goes out for the pump is just a completely benign circuit. Just comes in, goes through. When you turn the pump switch on, you can hear the relay closing, and that just turns the pump on and off. So if you wanted to convert this over to the same 4-wire connection that the other two controllers use, Brewhardware does offer a rewiring service to switch the input to this controller to a 4-wire NEMA 14-30P for an extra fee. But otherwise, this is what the factory looks like. The other thing is the temperature probe that it comes with has a slightly different connector than the other two units. This is like an 8-foot long cable, and it uses a 3.5 millimeter to go into the back of this unit. It's not as robust of a connection as the other two, because those use XLR, which is a more industrial type of connection. But these replacement probes are very inexpensive, less than $10, so you can have a couple of these on hand as replacements to replace if something goes wrong. So that's not really a big deal, but that's how they got this thing to be quite compact, to reduce the overall footprint on the back, is to have all the cables sticking out the back. All right, the last thing that I wanted to discuss was the cost and any extras that would be required when you're looking at the price. The most expensive of these three is clearly the Spike Solo controller, which at the time of this video filming is $599 US, and that is before you purchase the temperature probe and any cables to go to the element. So just to be clear, you get the long cable, but you do not get the actual temperature sensing probe that I'm showing here. These are disconnectable at the end of the cable. These get installed in your brewing system or somewhere in the brewing process. And the typical cost of one of these probes is $30 to $40. And they come in all different varieties. I have a couple here. This one happens to be an 1.5-inch tri-clamp flange with a very short, skinny probe. This is a weldless bulkhead probe. So this one, you drill a hole in the side of your kettle, push it through, tighten it up, and the gasket seals. Really reliable weldless connection here. And then there are also other types like 1/2-inch MPT of all different probe lengths. Auber Instruments has a huge variety of different form factors for these probes. All right, so figure $599 for the controller, another $30 to $40 for the temperature probe, and then another $30 or so for the cable to go to the element as well. So you're upwards of just under maybe $700 for the controller. So let's talk about the Blichmann Brew Commander. This one is pretty fully featured without a lot of extras to buy, because it does come with the temperature probe, the install fitting to do it weldlessly through your brew kettle. If you want to put the temperature probe into a tri-clamp port on your kettle, you will need to buy an adapter to get this fitting into a tri-clamp, but it's about $10, so not that big of a deal. It does come with a 10-foot long L630 extension cord, though it could only be used to get power into this device or from here into your element. So you may need one extra cable if you want to remote mount this somewhere distant from your your receptacle on the wall or slightly distant from your brewing kettle, because like I said, the dongles for in and out on the back of this unit are only about 8 inches long or so. So neither of them are really long enough to go directly to anything unless you put this right next to your brew kettle where the element is, and you can get the output plugged directly in there and use your 10-foot extension cord to go from the wall to here. The Auber controller price will vary a little bit depending on whether you have the DSPR 120, which is the simple one, or the more advanced DSPR 320. I think that's $25 more, give or take, for the more advanced module. And because it does not come with either the input or output cable, it could add up a little bit. So this one is going to land somewhere in between the Brew Commander and the Spike Solo in cost. Now, if you stuck with me this entire video, I really do appreciate it. I think this needed to be discussed so that you can really see what feature set there is. I do have a more table-based buyer's guide on brewhardware.com under guides on the website if you want to sort of compare all the features side by side instead of listening to the video all over again. But I really do appreciate your time, and if there are any controllers out there that you think I missed and are really should be contenders alongside these, let me know in the comments, and I will come up with a follow-up video to talk about those controllers, how they compare to these, for example, and possibly explain why I don't sell those controllers or why I don't rate them alongside these. And let me know what your favorite is on these. Let me know what you think is the features that you can't live without, and you know, will you pay more money for the looks of the Spike controller? Do you like how simple it is? Do you like how programmable the Auber Cube is? And would you deal with the sort of more cumbersome user interface to achieve that? These are all good questions. They're things you have to answer before you lay your money down. They're all, you know, over $400 to get up and running, but they're all very good controllers, and it's really just down to what you want. All right, I'll catch you on the next video, and thanks for watching.